QSO Today episode 398, John Fallows VE6EY. My thanks to Icom America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. I was notified today that Murray Greenman, ZL1BPU, passed away recently. Murray was a big amateur radio contributor, including many of the FSK digital modes used on HF. Like me, he was also known to sing in a number of Gilbert and Sullivan musicals. I will put a link to Murray's interview in episode 71, recorded in December 2015. May Murray's memory be for a blessing. John Fallows, VE6EY, when faced with an urban HF noise problem, applied his knowledge, expertise, and background from his years of experience in amateur radio to find a solution. This solution John presented last March in the last QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. Every problem leading to a solution has a story, and VE6EY tells it in this QSO Today. VE6EY, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, John?
Yes, we are.
John, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I grew up in Western Canada. We have two seasons in the city I grew up in. One is called winter and the other is called mosquito season. Anyway, I had a friend just lived down the street when I was in junior high school, and we were poking around in his grandparents' attic, found a whole bunch of old radios. Remember what radios used to look like with the wooden cases and the glow-in-the-dark tubes and stuff. So I became fascinated about getting some of them to work, and that sort of stimulated my interest in broadcasting and later in radio announcing and also ham radio.
What was the hometown in Western Canada?
Oh, the hometown, I was born in London, England, shortly after the war, and I guess these days you got to sort of specify which war. I was born in 1951, and we came to Winnipeg in 1956. I spent all my growing up years in Winnipeg, and it was a good place to live, still is. But I've lived most of my life since then in Western Canada, in the provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, where I am now. So that's my background.
And what is the QTH now?
I'm in Calgary, Alberta now. We moved out here some years ago after moving around the prairies on a number of jobs. We're in our final home now. We've been here around 20 years, and I have no plans to move.
Now, before you were poking around in your friend's grandparents' attic, looking at old radios, and boy, I sure remember poking around in my grandparents' attic and looking at old radios. Did you have any interest in electronics or electricity that even started there?
Probably my first interest in electricity and electronics was radio. My parents bought me, I don't know if you remember the rocket radios, the crystal radio.
Sure.
I used to lie in bed listening to that. And the trouble is it had no selectivity, so you'd have to listen to 3 stations at once.
Exactly.
And I was just thrilled a few years later when they bought me a real little transistor radio from Japan, and I could actually tune stations in. So I sort of started off with my interest in listening to the radio. And maybe what triggered my interest in the electronics of things was one day we were having breakfast, and in Winnipeg, breakfast in the winter meant you were in darkness. And there was a power failure in Winnipeg. And those were the days when the local radio stations did not have backup power. And all of a sudden, I'm listening to stations from all over North America that were being, normally hidden by the local stations. And it's, holy cow, there's a lot here to listen to. And that kind of got me started in medium wave DXing. And that's sort of the early first steps.
When you say a medium wave DXer, did that mean that you needed a different radio than the one that you had?
Not in those days. I didn't really think of it in those terms at first. I just sat around praying for power failures. But later on, when I was in maybe grade 9 or so, I met some people in the neighborhood that shared the interest, and they belonged to something called the Canadian International DX Club, CIDX. And that club is actually still around, amazingly enough. And we used to meet in a church once a month in the evening and have our local meeting in the church, and then go to a soda counter at a drugstore nearby for ice cream later. And then, lo and behold, by the time I get to high school, I'm the editor of the monthly newsletter, learning how to cut stencils and run a Gestetner. And that sort of got me into the sort of organized aspects of the hobby, at least the shortwave listening and medium wave DXing hobby. That gradually led to ham radio when I discovered, you can talk and transmit as well as listen.
You just use a localism. I think I understand what you were saying, but when you say a Gestetner, here in Israel, Gestetner is a company that makes copy machines. Is that what you were referring to?
Yeah, and this goes way back. You used a green stencil, and you typed with a typewriter, and the typewriter actually cut the letters out of the stencil. You then took that and put it on this Gestetner machine or copier machine, and the ink sort of came through the holes that your typewriter had cut in the stencil, and then you just turned the crank and made multiple copies of that same page.
Would that be a mimeograph machine? Would that be the same thing?
Yeah, same idea. The mimeographs quite often used some sort of spirits. The Gestetner used ink. But yeah, the same idea. And if you needed to correct your stencil, you needed some nail polish when you just sort of covered over the mistake and then cut some fresh holes. Yeah, boy, I'm glad those days are gone.
And how willing were your friends' grandparents to allow you to take radios out of the attic and see if you could get them working?
Well, the reason they were in the attic was because they had no further use. But, culturally, a lot of people don't throw things away. So they were happy for me to do that, yeah.
And as I recall, because I found these same kinds of radios in my grandparents' attic, they were in beautiful cases. You didn't really want to throw that stuff in the garbage.
Right. And a lot of them, it was just a bad tube or a switch that needed cleaning or something like that. So it was easy to work with. It just reminded me of a funny story. In grade 12 in high school, I worked in a department store in Winnipeg. And because of my background and interests, they stuck me in the radio TV repair department, which is where people would sort of come to the counter with radios that needed fixing. And I'll never forget the lady that came in with a bicycle tube and wanted to use the tube tester.
Were you able to calmly tell her that she needed to go downstairs to the sporting goods?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Working in a department store in customer service really helped me build confidence in dealing with all kinds of people with all kinds of problems. And I ended up in a management consulting career where I did pretty well the same thing for 25 years.
Did you get your amateur radio license while you were in high school?
Yes, I did. I think in grade 10, one of my neighbors said, there's a retired railway engineer about 4 blocks away who has got a ham radio station. Maybe you'd enjoy meeting him. So I walked down there and knocked on the door, and I met Bill Horner, VE4 Happy Willie, VE4HW. And he had a wonderful 75A4 receiver and a beam on a tower, and I spent many pleasant hours visiting and listening and learning from him. And also I had a few friends in the neighborhood with CB walkie-talkies. We used to talk to each other at night and stuff like that. So 1967 was our centennial year in Canada, and everybody was encouraged to do a personal centennial project. And so I made getting my first license my personal centennial project, and that was when I was 16. And so that's when I got started, and I upgraded to the advanced a year later, and that's the way it's been.
And the call sign that you got is the same one you have now?
No. In Canada, we're still strict about having a call letter that represents your geography. So my first call letter, and one I kept for many years, was VE4IA, and that was my Manitoba call letter. When I moved to Alberta, I got a couple of different calls, but for the most part, I've been VE6EY. And everybody sort of searches for a 2-letter call which are hard to get now. And I chose EY because it was available, and I'd worked at Ernst & Young for many years, so I thought that was kind of neat. So.
And what was your first rig?
My first Tam Station, well, actually, my first Tam Station was the radio club in high school that I started, and we built some Heathkit gear. I think the HR-10 was the receiver, and the DX40 was the transmitter. And so that was sort of my first station. My first personal station I bought at a Winnipeg Amateur Radio Club flea market. It was a used Viking Ranger transmitter and an AR-77 receiver. I put a dipole in my bedroom for 20 meters and got on the air.
So you hung the dipole from corner to corner in your room?
Yeah. Well, actually, it wasn't even that. It was bent around the room. In hindsight, I know why I made very few contacts. That's how you got started. I started working full-time in 1972 after a few years. Well, actually, I went to university in 1969 and joined the University of Manitoba Amateur Radio Club, VE4UM. And they had a wonderful station in the Student Union building, and I spent many years operating that. And then I got involved in student politics and student radio and all that kind of stuff. And finally, when I stopped playing at university, I started working full-time as a radio announcer in 1972. And my first paycheck went to buying a Kenwood TS520. Then I moved into an apartment, put a beam and a vertical on the roof, and that was my station for a number of years.
Okay, now did you end up getting a degree in broadcasting or engineering or anything like that from the University of Manitoba?
No, it's a funny story there. My first round in the late 60s, early 70s, I was doing political science and sociology. At that point, I considered engineering, but most of my friends were always complaining about dropping their holograph cards in the hallway as they tried to write computer programs. So I kind of shied away from that. But I got involved in student radio, and then that led me to being communications commissioner for the Students' Union. And then I organized a campus-wide event called the Festival of Life and Learning that I chaired for a few years. So I got an education in organizing and student politics, but I never actually graduated with a degree. But I was able to go back later in life and get my master's degree, but that's a different story.
You're now a professional radio announcer. Did you move around from station to station? I understand that many radio announcers, radio personalities actually are quite migratory.
Yeah, you got to keep in mind radio's kind of like a farm system, like in professional hockey, for example. And you start at the night shift at the rural station, and then you work your way up. So I was very lucky. I had a personal contact recommend me to work the night show on a station in Winnipeg called CJOB, which was a wonderful place to work. And I worked my way up there. From the night shift to the evening shift, and eventually doing weekend mornings and stuff like that. And then eventually I became interested in management, and I got hired to build a radio station in southern Manitoba. And I built that and got it on the air. And then I moved out to Alberta to try to start another radio station. And, things went on like that. And after about 15 years, I decided that, well, two things sort of came to mind. One thing was that, to make any money in the broadcasting, you either had to do the morning show or become sales manager, and I wasn't interested in either. And I don't know if you remember the old TV show WKRP in Cincinnati.
Sure.
Yeah, I realized one day that I had done every job in that station. And by the way, in WKRP was more real than comedy. Except for Lonnie Anderson, I'd done all the jobs. I just couldn't see myself doing that for a long time. I applied to the University of Manitoba to go back to school and do my MBA under what they call a special considerations category for people that didn't have an undergraduate degree, and I was very lucky to get in and do that. And that led me then to my next career as a management consultant. I mean, I have fond memories of broadcasting, and I write fondly on my blog about about CJOB and the time there, but it was a great career when you were 20. But as you got older and the family started, it was really kind of boring, to be honest.
And also, it's probably hard on a family to kind of be a gypsy in the trade.
Yeah, but I ended up in management consulting. Every time I got a promotion, it was to move to a different city. And so we've actually moved and resettled 12 times in 3 different cities and 4 different cities. So I've been a bit of a gypsy, and that's part of the reason why now in Calgary we have 3 sons, they have families and stuff. We have no desire to leave now, so my gypsy days have passed. But it was okay because I got to meet a lot of people and do a lot of interesting things. It's interesting. Sometimes people wonder how ham radio affects you in life. Like, how does it affect your family? Well, for me, my family affected my radio hobby. Because when the kids started coming along, I just put the hobby aside for 15 years and looked after the kids and my career and became a soccer coach and all that kind of stuff. So it took a few years to get back into it, Eric.
And now this message from Icom America. Now is the time to spice up your ham shack with Icom's new ID52A handheld portable radio. Now shipping. This radio is perfect for staying in or venturing out and working your favorite VHF and UHF bands this winter season. Did I say that the Icom ID52A is now shipping? Icom's newest handheld radio is a VHF-UHF dual bander with D-Star and FM dual mode functions. This radio supports conventional FM communications and D-Star simplex, repeater, regional, and worldwide calls over the D-Star Internet Gateway. The Icom ID52A is the first handheld amateur radio with a full-color 2.3-inch waterfall display and the ability to send photos over D-Star with a connected Android device. Other ID52A features include a wideband receiver with guaranteed range of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz. It supports VV, UU, VU, and dual DV mode. It has an integrated GPS GLONASS receiver, including grid square locations. Other features include micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer and programming and charging, and of course it is IPX7 waterproof in case you drop it. Be sure to check out the new Icom ID52A at your nearest ham radio dealer, along with a full line of amazing Icom radios. And when you make that Icom purchase, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO Today. And when did you come back into ham radio?
I came back in the mid-'90s. I'd had a heart problem, and I was taking a leave of absence, and I took some courses on stress and stuff, or, some counseling on stress. And a number of people suggested, you should spend more time on hobbies, not just on working. And so I bought myself a ham radio rig at a flea market sale and got back on the air. And discovered things were a lot more different in the mid-'90s for putting up antennas and stuff like that. But it sort of got me back into the game after 15 years away. And, I'd maintained some interest. Back when I was in broadcasting, I'd gone to a National Association of Broadcasters conference in Las Vegas. That would have been 1980. And I met a guy named Ulrich, DJ2LR.
Who was a guest on the QSO Today podcast.
Yeah, a wonderful guy. And he just started to write articles in Ham Radio Magazine and QST about receiver design. And those were the days when people were discovering up conversion to 40 megahertz or 60 meg IFs and stuff like that. But he got me really interested in receivers. And I must have talked to him for 2 hours at the convention. And so since then, I've had this interest in receivers, which has really exploded more recently with the SDRs. That's sort of been one of the things that stimulated my interest. And, also it helped having at least an informal technical background, because when I was consulting and even when I was in broadcasting, I was one of the few people that actually understood the technology of the business as well as the culture of the business. And that helped me quite a lot as well.
Let's go back to when you first came back in the 90s. You said something about antennas were different. What did you mean by that?
Oh, well, when I moved into my apartment block and I went and told the landlord or the building manager I wanted to put an antenna on the roof, her only concern was, well, make sure it doesn't fall off. I was able to put up a beam on a small mount and a vertical and run the cable over the edge to my top floor apartment. And it was pretty informal. The beam was held down with some sandbags and on a piece of plywood. Then I got married and moved into a house, and took me a couple of months. But next thing you know, there was a 50-foot tower with a TA-33 up in the backyard. It was kind of easy to get into the antenna business. When I got back into ham radio in the mid-90s, we don't really have these same homeowner things in most parts of Canada, but there's a lot of municipal regulation that's evolved, and it's so much harder to put up antennas in the urban centers these days, and that's led to I did manage to get a 50-foot tower up here. I have actually pretty well the same setup here as I did back in the 70s. But for a lot of people, it's harder. And you really can't, if you're interested in HF, it's really hard to enjoy HF these days unless you put some sort of decent antenna up on a tower. Not so much because of the height and the angles and stuff, but it's to get your antenna away from all the RFI. So those are the big differences between, when I got started in radio, RFI was something, you heard about ignition noise in cars and stuff like that, but that was about all. But when I got back in the mid-90s, more since the early 2000s, RFI has become a huge problem that we never had before. Back in the day, the concern was, am I interfering with my neighbor's television, right?
Exactly.
And so those are no longer the problems. Now we have the VDSL digital signals coming in on your phone line that interfere with your ham radio. So it's sort of been a reversal.
Yeah, and there's just a lot of stuff, that we're now running, a lot of switching supplies that seem to make the noise floor, in an urban environment. Do you think that there's also a sensitivity by the general public that radio waves, radio radiation, quote unquote, is harmful?
Yeah, there is. There's even a big movement now, especially in California, that electricity is harmful. And you see all kinds of people advertising these filters to make your electricity clean. And most of it is just rubbish. But a lot of people are going for that. And there are some issues. You don't want to stick your head inside a kilowatt transmitter or anything like that. But, we live now in a risk society where everybody's afraid of everything and they want a regulation for this and a regulation for that. I'm surprised we still have playgrounds anymore.
Diving boards are missing, I've noticed, since we were kids in the public pool.
Yeah, it's sad in many ways. We could get into a long discussion about evolution.
In the last 60 years, perhaps, right? Just that evolution.
Well, yeah.
I'm laughing because you're giving me an idea for a product. I mean, obviously, it seems to me that if we're going to depend upon electric cars, is anybody aware of what kind of noise electric motors make?
Well, it's really interesting, Eric, because as you know, I did a presentation on your Expo on diversity reception and its use in noise reduction. And one of the people who saw that sent me an email this week and asked me to come and talk to a think tank in the broadcast industry who are trying to tackle the problem of manufacturers discontinuing the use of AM radios in electric cars. And I think BMW was the first, but others are starting to follow, and the broadcasters are concerned about that. And of course, when you think about it, your electric car is fundamentally, it's not the same as a switch mode power supply, but it's very similar. So, to actually receive radio in one of the newer cars is even a bigger challenge than trying to live with solar panels surrounding your ham radio station. So, I'll be joining in that discussion next, I think, 2 weeks from now. But yeah, but that's life. Technologies evolve, and each technology we invent to solve one problem generally creates two, and every regulation we put in place to solve one problem generally fails and creates more problems. But that's just the world we live in, and human beings are complex adaptive systems. We just muddle through and figure it out.
It's an evolutionary process, right, John?
It is, and it's made even harder today because change happens so quickly. By definition, humans have to deal with change because everything changes. But when you sort of get forced to move from one paradigm to another paradigm before you sort of figured out the old one, it's quite hard. And, I have to keep that in mind whenever I'm talking to my grandchildren or even my sons. They live in an entirely different world than I grew up in. So like when my wife and I bought our first house, the conventional wisdom was pay your mortgage off really, really quickly because so much of your payment is going to interest and not enough to principal. But if I give that advice today, when interest rates are like 3%, my kids kind of would look at me and say, Dad, that's not the world we live in.
And that is a whole other conversation that we should save for later, and maybe that'll be a different podcast.
It's the same for ham radio operators who've been around like for 40, 50 years. They try to sort of get the newcomers into the hobby to adopt their old paradigms, and they don't realize that they're irrelevant, But that's a conversation for later or for another day. Part of the problem I have, Eric, is when I retired, I decided to get a PhD. But I didn't go back to school. I spent the first 3 years of retirement reading, mostly philosophy and sociology and stuff, technology. I can talk about so many things with sort of a little bit of authority these days that it's hard to have a conversation without 20 rat holes opening up to dive down. So I'll try to control myself.
That's exactly the problem that I have as well. I seem to know a little bit about a lot of things, but not a lot about anything. I guess that's what happens. Okay, so you've got my interest here, and it seems to me that as a retired person now, you have a blog, and I'm going to put a link to that blog in the show notes so that people can actually follow what you're doing. It appears to me that you've done exactly that. You've read for 3 years, and then you're starting off, and you're doing lots of projects. So can we start a little bit about how you started the blog, and what was the first project?
Let's jump back to the late 90s. As part of my rehabilitation out of my health scare, I started writing software. And I wrote in Delphi. I still write in Delphi, which is like a form of Pascal. And I wrote a program called Ergo, which was designed to integrate remote control of radios with databases with propagation evaluation. And I began selling that in 1998, and I updated it in the year 2000. And amazingly, that software still works because I religiously stuck to the Windows API, and Microsoft has actually done a super job at maintaining backwards compatibility. So that product's lasted about 25 years, and it's at end of life now because very few people are buying radios with serial ports on the back. So that got me started in writing software. And so when I retired, I sort of said, well, I'm interested in radio, ham radio, shortwave listening. I'm interested in writing software. And then I discovered 3D printing. And I said, I'm going to sort of try to bring all these things together and do projects where I can make use of my ham radio, my 3D printing or making, and writing software. And then that led me into the Arduino and, microcontrollers and stuff like that. So I started playing around with that. And then I said, I'm doing all these projects. And a friend of mine, I was working on revamping the local radio club website. And the technical guy we hired said, have you ever looked at WordPress? And I remembered WordPress as a very rudimentary publishing system, but it had really improved. And so bringing all those things together, I said, it's really simple to start a WordPress blog because the software is open source and stuff like that. So I said, I'm going to do a blog where I can document all my projects and my interests and stuff like that. And that's how the Making It Up blog got started. And for my my editorial stance, I sort of said, I want to take these projects I'm doing, which involve learning, and they involve getting from sort of beginner to intermediate. And I'm going to write a blog where I can help other people get from beginner to intermediate. So you'll never find expert stuff on my blog, although that's arguable in a couple of narrow areas. But, that's what I've been trying to do. And so my projects really have evolved around 3D printing, making radio microcontrollers, and more recently loop antennas. So that's been my one big focus in sort of pulling all these things together so I can make sort of an internet of. So, for example, I just finished building last year Wi-Fi controlled loop antenna mast, and it basically has rotation control for a loop as well as a system for tuning a butterfly capacitor to tune the loop. And I built all the parts to hold it together in my 3D printer, including the gears for the worm gear and stuff like that. And then I hooked it up to a Node MCU, which is like an Arduino with Wi-Fi built in. And lo and behold, it just works. And this summer, I'll try experimenting with loops using this controller. That's part of the interest. The other part of the interest has really developed into fighting RFI. You'll find a lot of stuff on my blog about RFI. What is it? How do you deal with it? And all of that kind of started when I had this terrible buzzing noise show up one day. I called the power company. They'd come out before and they'd done something to a local power pole and fixed the problem. So I called them again. And the guy came out and said, there's nothing wrong with the power pole. It's your neighbor. This neighbor, about 150 yards west of me, had a kitchen renovation done. And the electrician had wired up three halogen lights in the kitchen cabinets, but he'd broken the approved harness, which was supposed to be no longer than 10 feet, and he'd put in a harness of around 60 feet and also a thinner gauge wire. This setup that the neighbor had spent $50,000, $60,000 on a new kitchen turned into one huge RFI transmitter. So a lot of what I've done in the last 6 years on the blog is finding different ways to get rid of that noise. And I'm now at the point where I can just make it disappear. I can get it from S9 to 0. And that's driven a lot of my interest too. So that's the more practical side.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA30N, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. John, can we go back? Were you able to talk to that neighbor and see whether or not there was something that you could do to reduce the noise, change out the wiring, whatever?
Yes, I was. And I went in, I sort of hooked up my receiver to a server and took my laptop over there, and I could pick up the receiver, and I showed them when you turn the kitchen lights on and off, how the noise comes on and off. And so they had sympathy for me, but they weren't prepared to spend $70,000 again on their kitchen. I did a lot of troubleshooting, but I didn't know as much then as I know now. I've sort of gotten to the point now where if I could get an electrician to go over there and replace their switch mode power supply with a linear power supply, that would make the noise go away. But that would mean I'd have to have some responsibility for the installation in their home, and that brings up insurance problems and this and that. And plus, you can't find very many electricians that know anything about electronics or radio. So anyway, I sort of gave up. And by then, once I'd learned enough, I knew how to make that noise go away through several techniques. And so I'm now focused more on fighting RFI than I am fighting with neighbors. You know what I mean?
Well, it sounds to me that you actually have come up with a solution. That solution, by the way, you describe in the presentation that you made at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo to some degree, I think. Perhaps you'll even go into greater detail in the future in terms of what the steps actually are and how to end up building that system?
Yeah, I've gone into quite a lot of detail on my blog, and what I'm focusing on now, Eric, is trying to be a missionary to ham radio manufacturers. What the technique is, it's really simple. and shortwave listeners have been, and hams have been using it since the 1990s. There's a device called an ANC4 or the MFJ 1026. They're called noise cancelers, which is not a good name, but that's what they're called. And basically with those analog devices, you hook up what I call a noise probe, or a small antenna that just picks up noise. And then you phase reverse and amplitude match that noise so that you can subtract the two before it gets to your receiver. That's the analog way of doing it. And the trick there is figuring out a good noise antenna. What I'm doing now is using dual channel, so-called diversity receivers that have two channels, basically two receivers slaved together, and using an antenna for the noise on one channel and then phase reversing and amplitude matching. It's the same technique that people have been using for noise canceling headphones, where you just basically phase reverse the noise and subtract it from the main signal. And it works quite well. Its weakness is you can really only kill one major noise source at once, but often that's 90% of what you're doing anyway. And I'm trying to get ham manufacturers to actually start building this capability into their rigs. We've got a ton of medium range and high range gear that's got diversity reception built in. It's got dual channel coherent receivers, but the ham manufacturers are stuck on the beverage paradigm from the mid-1920s, which is basically multipath noise cancellation. And multipath noise cancellation is a good thing, and diversity reception works fine for that. That's not the problem most of us have. The problem most of us have is noise. So hopefully in a few years, the manufacturing community will take the final tiny steps they need to modify their gear to actually do these things, rather than telling people, okay, put on a pair of stereo headphones and let your brain sort it out. I'm sorry, your brain can't do a switch mode power supply noise cancellation, no matter how good your brain is. So anyway, that's my latest soapbox.
Well, I think that's a great solution to a problem that we all have. I mean, if you don't live out in the boonies, I happen to live on the edge of my community, so I'm able to get my antennas far enough away from the neighborhood that I can actually hear something. But if you're in the middle of a neighborhood, it can be really hard. The plasma TVs, the power supplies for recharging just about anything, USB, makes all kinds of noise.
Right, and even just in its very simple form, any kind of switching device that's switching 60 hertz is going to give you a pulse train of 120 hertz. Pulse trains generally create impulses, and once you create a very narrow, rapid switching impulse at 120 hertz, it's going to spread up to VHF. That's just the way the math works, and that's the way the physics works. Then if that leaks into your household wiring, there are going to be occasional resonances where basically your household wiring will act as a resonant antenna. So, for example, my neighbor's light system and her house wiring effectively create a 10 to 12 megahertz jammer. And that's what I've had to sort of try to get rid of. And so, these are modern problems. So, and I've said this to Rob Sherwood, and I've said this to other people, the specs people worried about in their ham radio gear, dynamic range and sensitivity. Well, for 90% of us that live in an urban area, maybe it's 95% of us live in an urban area, we don't care about sensitivity because the local noise floor created by man-made interference is so high. We'd probably do just fine with, a noise floor in our receivers of maybe 120, minus 120 dBm or minus 110. And as for dynamic range, well, most of us don't run multiple stations in a contest environment, or most of us don't live in Central Europe with very large local transmitters. So dynamic range isn't that big a deal for us. Like here in Western Canada, the chances of being overloaded by a signal are virtually nil. What we have is local RFI, and we have it from 20 houses within 150 yard or meter radius around us and stuff like that. And so, all of this gear coming out now with their specs on dynamic range and sensitivity is just a total waste of time for 90% of hams that couldn't take advantage of either of those features because of the local noise. So let's wake up, guys.
What is the current rig there?
I currently have a Flex 6300, and recently I bought an Anan 7000 DLE for its diversity features. And my classic rig is now a Yaesu FT1000D. So that's my ham side. I've got a whole bunch of SDRs, including the Perseus, the Ephedri dual channel, and the SDR Play RSP Duo.
And what do you do with all of those, John? I mean, I'm curious. You've got the FT1000D. You say you want an old rig to go back to when you want to play single sideband or something?
Yeah, so I'll use the FT1000D just for casual QSO. Before that, I also had a Drake 4 R4 and T4X, but I sold that. But to be honest, I don't spend a lot of time transmitting. I can find more interesting things to do than talk to somebody around the world that I really have no interest in common with. So when I do find someone to talk to that I share a common interest with, it's great. I don't spend a lot of time actually transmitting. Although, to be fair, with the new cycle, I'm thinking I got to get back on the air and spend more time on the air. You talked about managing your time. There's only so many things you can do in a day. I've got too many of them. too many things to do.
In your retirement, yeah. I'm curious, with the software-defined radios, almost all the ones that you listed, I think you can go from like 10 kilohertz to 3 gigahertz almost. What do you listen to with the software-defined radio? Are you still kind of the shortwave listener? Do you like police radio? What interests you with software-defined radio?
Yeah, I'm mostly into HF, Eric. When I was building that Ergo software, I had to figure out how propagation worked and how to actually estimate. So I taught myself a bit about propagation estimation and formulas and algorithms and stuff like that. And that really reinforced in me sort of the magic of shortwave radio, that you can sort of put a couple hundred watts on the air and bounce around the world and talk to people. And, to me, it's kind of neat. HF I like. Unfortunately, there's less and less to listen to in the English language on shortwave. There's still a bunch of utility listening and so on you can do. And the BBC and Radio China and Greece and South America, you can still find stuff to listen to, especially the music is nice and stuff like that. Medium wave DXing, since I built my wideband loop array, I can actually steer nulls in various directions and listen to multiple stations on AM broadcast frequencies. So I'll do that at night in the evening. There again, I'm sort of swamped by a lot of American meaningless talk shows in the evening. But beyond that, it's fun, and I can play with my various diversity reception and loop array and stuff like that to listen to. So that's really what I do a lot of. I did get DMR going last year, and I'll do that a little bit. But mostly I'm an HF guy. That's what I really enjoy.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. You wrote a paper, and I wanted to follow up on it. Can the maker community be a gateway to amateur radio, and how would you do that?
The maker community is a gateway to many things. The problem is the ham radio world puts up so many firewalls to stop these people from getting in.
For example?
Well, when you get your ham radio license, you're basically taught enough to pass the test, and that's fair enough. When your local ham radio club is primarily focused on building repeaters that no one uses, or building a DX contest station that almost no one uses, that's kind of a firewall, because it's not doing enough to maintain the interest of younger people who are just not the least bit interested in getting a walkie-talkie and talking on a repeater that no one listens to. So, a ham radio club, for example, should, rather than taking these young makers who are playing with stuff like the Hack RF. So you got a ton of young people who are getting Hack RFs or Red Pateas or stuff like that and playing around with them. Why try to force them to learn how to work a Yaesu radio in a contest? They may or may not, they may or may not be interested in that. Better off, you should kind of help them learn how to use ham radio for their hobbies. So, for example, the the Ham Radio Club at the University of Calgary that formed a few years ago got involved with some people who are doing atmospheric research using balloons. And so they've learned how to combine that interest with sending telemetry on ham radio frequencies and stuff like that. So make it more of a two-way street. So that's what you need to do. You are never going to create a new cadre of people just like me that played with radios and did all the things, Eric, that you and I have done over the years. It's not relevant anymore. But there's tons of other stuff we could be doing with them. And so, yes, there's a lot of stuff in the ham radio legacy that's good, and the camaraderie and the public service and all that kind of stuff. But you need to find it in new ways. You need to reach people where they are, not try to bring them to where you are.
I agree with you, by the way, John. But it sounds to me, though, that what needs to happen is that the people that run amateur radio clubs and the people that have been members of those clubs for years and years, they too now have a bunch of new skills that they may need to learn in order to be able to attract those young people that want to do a hack RF project. So it seems to me that maybe an innovative guy like you may need to actually create some kind of a course for the existing members just to be able to be sensitive to new members.
That's true. My personal experiences have been our local club here is like many others where it spends way too much time on silly politics and not enough on actually a core mission. I hate to say it, but I've just given up. Yes, I could do those sort of things, but I wouldn't turn to my local club to do them. I would turn to the World Wide Web. I do it globally.
Right. I would too.
Right. So you can either go out and find a bunch of people who you share common interests with and actually want to work together, or you can try to be a missionary and change your local radio club. Well, which is going to get you more success? And the answer is kind of obvious.
I agree with you on the one hand. On the other hand, I think that some people actually need the live mentor.
Sure.
If you can find that guy that can provide the hands-on demonstration, for example. I wrote on one of the QSO Today episodes, we were talking about how do you get people to learn how to fix the repeater if you're involved with fixing it. And sometimes you just need to take someone along to hold the light, and that's how they learn.
Yes, absolutely. And, mentoring is probably the most important thing for becoming proficient. Well, it's actually probably the most important thing from moving to novice to beginner to intermediate to proficient to competent and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so I have been very fortunate that I have found some local mentors that got me started on things I'd never even thought of before. And I've done that with a few other people as well. A great way to do that is through your local club. But another great way to do it is just to go on the World Wide Web and find other people who are already doing it.
That's right, yeah.
It's not an either or. My comments were perhaps too critical, Eric. It's just, when you beat your head against the wall against some of the legacy behaviors we have, and you realize, I don't need to do it this way. I can find another way to do it. Then, you sort of become stoic and just walk away. And maybe that's not a good thing, but I think it's a coping mechanism. I'm not interested in spending a whole bunch of my time having political fights with clubs and associations. I'd just sooner go and find a community of interest and get involved.
Obviously, that's getting easier now, right? I think maybe the pandemic has kind of taught us we can do a lot of stuff on the internet, like we're doing now, for example, and you can learn an awful lot in a Zoom session, if it's done well.
Yeah, and I've had local and global people come to me and say, can you help me with this? Can you help me with that? And I'm more than happy to help them. Mentoring is a lot of fun. There was all these maker fairs and stuff like that, and they still go on. But it's actually easier, unfortunately, to find people in different countries that share common interests with you than it is to find them in your own neighborhood, right? And that's just the way the internet's set up. We don't really have it's coming, but we don't have the kind of geotagging that lets you put out a call and say, okay, I'd love to mentor somebody in 3D printing and send that message to just the people within 15 miles of your home. It's easy to send that message to the whole planet, right?
This is true.
Yeah, so, if we had some better ways of using our social media to create these groups more locally or regionally, then that would help.
I think we're getting there, don't you think? I don't know. We've got a WhatsApp group for everything. I have a WhatsApp group for the street. I have a WhatsApp group for the neighborhood. It's quite interesting in terms of I find something, I say, oh, I found something, and I take a picture of it and put it on the WhatsApp group for the street, and someone says, oh, yeah, I lost that. So it's kind of like, is anybody 3D printing on the street? Well, half the people are on the street are 3D printing somehow.
Yeah. You raise a very good point, Eric, because I don't use WhatsApp, and maybe I should. Part of the problem is we have such a proliferation. Life used to be really simple. Now you've sort of got to load a new app for everything you want to do. And maybe what I got to figure out is what are the next generation of apps I need to load to do the things I want to do. And shame on me for not figuring that out yet. But there again, there's only so many hours in a day.
This is exactly right. Well, John, I want to know, you're retired and you appear to be prolific in terms of the projects that you're doing, at least that you're documenting. How do you set up your day? Are you on a calendar, even in your retirement, to make sure that you have the time to spend to thoughtfully think about a project and work it through and actually finish it?
Yeah, I'm not as disciplined as I probably could be or should be. Like I ought to actually go back to my consulting days and do project plans the way I used to. But it's more organic than it is strictly developed. What happens is I write my blog. I'm usually a month ahead in the articles I post because I like to know that a project's actually going to work before I start writing about it. I'll start a project. I'll get an idea. Like, right now I'm building some dual channel antenna relay switching for my various SDRs and loop array and stuff like that. Basically, I have to keep in mind for my projects, am I going to get the parts on eBay? So I need to think 1 to 2 months ahead, or do I have the parts in stock? So what's the latency of getting the parts for the thing I'm trying to do? And then I have to think through, okay, how might this work? And how might I want to do it? And what pieces do I have to put in place to make it to work? And so I generally get started with an idea and do some early experiments or proof of concepts. And I document everything I do with photographs in the PowerPoint deck, as well as notes. I use OneNote a lot for documenting my projects. And then I get to the point where I've collected enough stuff and I know it's going to work. And then I use the blog to create the discipline. Like, okay, I'm building this thing. What are the different posts I'm going to do to create a series of articles about what I've done? And where am I going to put this information and that information and stuff like that? And then I just start writing and documenting. And then sometimes I'll make a circuit board and people will ask me for the Gerber files, or I'll do a 3D print and people will ask me for the STLs and stuff like that. So I try to keep myself organized so that I can respond to somebody who inquires about something I did 5 years ago. In terms of my personal day, I sort of fit things in 2 or 3 hour chunks. A typical project I'll work on, I may spend 100 hours on it. So it's going to take me maybe 6 weeks to get it finished. I'll work on stuff for a while. I go for walks 2 times a day for about 45 minutes each. So I'll sort of get to a certain point and say, okay, I'm just going to go for a walk and just let it ruminate in the back of my mind. You fit all these things in between the grandchildren and, the visits and the family stuff. It's been a lot easier with not doing much traveling in the last few years. Sometimes when we used to go cruising a lot, I would save up the literature for a big project. Like when I wanted to build my own CNC machine, I collected all my articles onto an iPad, and just when we were away cruising for 2 weeks, in spare time, I would read about CNC machines and stuff like that. So I'm sort of getting to the point now where I'm saying to myself, okay, after 6 years doing all this stuff, and I'm now in my 70s, how do I want to change my style going forward? And I haven't answered that yet, but right now it's just sort of fitting all stuff together, and the discipline of trying things and documenting. Like, the nice thing about 3D printing is you can build a prototype. It'll take a few hours to print, but if you end up saying, no, that doesn't quite work, I'll try something else, you're only throwing away $1 worth of plastic. So, so who cares? So, stuff like 3D printing and having your own CNC machine makes you more adventurous. for sort of trying something. And if it doesn't quite work, okay, throw it away because you haven't invested a whole bunch of money in it.
And what are you using the CNC machine for?
So actually, I sold my CNC machine because I decided what I was mainly interested in for my first CNC was making plates for a butterfly capacitor for a 5-foot small transmitting loop. And I looked at the cost of buying those plates, and I said, for the cost of buying those plates, I could actually build a CNC machine. So I basically built a CNC machine, and I milled those 20 plates for a butterfly capacitor out of thin aluminum and built the loop and got it to work and stuff like that. And then I found I really wasn't using it because I'm not into woodworking, so I sold it. And then a few years later, I said, I should get into isolation milling for printed circuit boards. And so I got a smaller but more accurate CNC, one of those 3018 models from Genmitsu. And I milled a few printed circuit boards. And the few guys I was mentoring with, they got their stuff going and so on. And then I realized, this is an awful lot of work for a one-off when I can just basically buy it for $5 plus shipping from China, right? So I basically said, okay, this was fun. It was a great learning experience. I proved I can do it. Some great blog articles, but I'm really not going to spend a lot of my life milling CNC machines because the kind of stuff I do, it's easier to get them made in China. So basically I sold the CNC, I think, for around $400. And I figured, well, that $400 is going to buy me lots of circuit boards from China over the next 10 years. So I sort of got out of that. The 3D printing is different. I use it all the time for all kinds of things. And it's the much more useful tool for me just because of the things that I do. So a lot of my 3D printing stuff are just basically project boxes or mounting structures or stuff like that. And if I need a shielded box, I'll just use some of my MG chemical spray to shield it, and it works fine.
I had a 3D printer that I never used. I bought it thinking I was going to use it, never used it. So I semi-permanently loaned it to a 13-year-old 2 doors down. It's my understanding that thing runs all the time, 24/7. He's making all kinds of stuff. So maybe we'll have a mechanical engineer on the street at some point. I've been told if I want to send over a design, then he'll print it for me.
One of the things in building proficiency in different kinds of projects is to learn to use some of the software tools. So, for example, my mentor in home brewing, a local ham named Jim, he got me started using LT Spice to simulate circuits. And when I was actually trying to get into wideband loops, I actually built an LT Spice module to simulate a 1 meter copper loop. From there, I was able to use that tool to then simulate different kinds of systems with different amplifiers to see how these things actually work. And it's amazing because in the real world, they actually work pretty close to what your tool says. And then I learned to use KiCad to document circuits and design circuit boards, and that's quite useful. And then I learned to use sort of the Fusion kind of product to do CAD work for making models for 3D printing and for CNCing. And once you've gotten down the learning curve on these tools, it just opens you up to a whole bunch of things you can do really quickly. And so I recommend to people they pick a few tools and use them a lot and get down the learning curve, and then you can do all sorts of things.
And if you can find a mentor that can maybe boost you, right, like you did with LT Spice.
Yeah, so I've got a friend in Regina who's a model railway guy. He comes to visit Calgary to see a family, maybe every 6 months or 3 months or whatever. And he'll come by and he'll see me 3D printing. And the next thing I know, he's bought himself a 3D printer and he's making models for his model railway. And then he'll come and he'll see my Arduino work and Node MCU work and stuff like that. The next thing I know, he's got microcontrollers running his model railway. So for the right kind of person who's got the interest, you just need to plant the seed and they just run away.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
So, okay, software-defined radio excites me a lot. I personally have decided not to get into programmable hardware, like using FPGA and writing the VDSL code for for doing that. It's too much of an investment at my age, but I sure love the people who are doing it. And, to me, software-defined radio that can get signals down to baseband. And, as Jerry Youngblood said in an early QEX article on his pre-Flex days, he said, give me an I and a Q and I can do anything. Right. And so the ability to sort of take radio signals into a wideband ADC and then get them down to baseband, and you can do all kinds of stuff with them. To me, that is just wonderful. That's just great stuff. And so, I think we got to the point now where SDR is just sort of the technology people are going to use for all sorts of things. That excites me. Meeting people with common interests, sometimes hams, not always hams. But people with common interests online, that kind of excites me at how easy that is to do today. Those are the things that excite me about amateur radio. I get QST and I read it every month, and I read QEX. QEX probably excites me. QST, by and large, there's very little in there that excites me. So, I don't see ham radio going away too soon, but the way it's structured, it's on a slow decline that really... I don't think there'll be more than another generation of hams, unfortunately. So that's probably not what you want to hear, Eric.
No, it isn't necessarily. I could see that if we don't do something that potentially could happen. What do you think the greatest challenge then facing amateur radio is now, since you've said this?
I think there's two challenges. One is we need to rebrand amateur radio. Like, why on earth do we call it amateur radio? Like, really? Why do we call it that? other than the legacy of that it's been called that, I think there has to be a massive rebranding that ties in people who are interested in doing wireless communications in a variety of formats that includes many of the legacy things, but also includes so much more than that. I mean, we have these huge chunk of frequencies that are available to us. They're dropping away slowly, but that's really what differentiates a ham radio, is the ability to be a license to transmit and do all sorts of things. But we need to rebrand. Amateur radio is probably the most useless name for the hobby, since many of us are actually working at a professional level. The reason it was called amateur radio was because we didn't work on ships run by the Marconi Company. I mean, that's the only reason it's called amateur radio. And that was in 1911. Come on, folks. The ARRL, should just rebrand itself totally, because Amateur Radio Relay League, I mean, give me a break. Do you ever listen to local net? I mean, who wants to sit there for an hour listening to people say QRU? I mean, the last time I heard a piece of traffic passed on one of these nets was probably in the 1980s. That's the biggest challenge, is finding the way to rebrand and reinvent ourselves, to capture a lot of the stuff about the hobby that's really, really good, but get rid of the legacy stuff that's irrelevant and make ourselves more relevant to people, especially going through university these days. I remember I once gave a talk to the local university amateur radio club, and I had, most of them were very, very new hams. I had more in common with them than I did with the amateur radio, the main amateur radio club, right? So I think we need to rebrand. Could I keep doing the whole thing that I'm doing now without being called an amateur radio operator? Yeah, I could do 90% of it. I could give up my ham license because I transmit so rarely, it doesn't matter. But I don't want to do that because I still want the ability to talk to Eric in Israel on 20 meters in the afternoon or some morning, because I just think that's magic and it's wonderful.
I think it was Ulrich Rohde on this podcast that brought up the idea that we're custodians of an international national park, which is the amateur radio bands. We have this national park to play in the guise of our license. The license is what allows us to have that access. It seems too valuable to let go, but, you may be right. In a couple of generations, it might be gone.
Personally, I don't want to give it up. I agree with Ulrich. That's just a wonderful way of looking at it. I've looked at it also from an environmental point of view. I mean, ionospheric communications is something that we have that's magic, or it's not magic, actually, it's physics, but, we should do our best to protect it and nurture it for future generations. And that's a great way of looking at it. Yeah, so I'm not going to give up on my ham radio license. I'll still calling myself an amateur radio operator. That's fine. Around that, there has to be some serious rebranding if we want to make ourselves relevant. And it's not just branding from a PR point of view, it's also cultural change.
I think I agree with you. I mean, I hadn't thought about it until you mentioned it, but here in Israel, we're called Chovevi Radio. We're friends of radio, radio friends. I don't know if that's any better than amateur radio when you're trying to explain it to someone what it is you're doing.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, I'm not being too critical that nobody's done this yet, because it's, never mind getting the agreement to do it, but it's really hard to think of exactly what the new branding or the new paradigm should be. But we need a new paradigm, and I think all the pieces are out there. But, the paradigm based on interfering with the Titanic rescue operations because we were playing music, which we weren't back then. But, I mean, that's a wonderful history, Eric, and it's a wonderful legacy. But the thing about baggage is it doesn't take you anywhere. Baggage is something you take with you, right? So, using our baggage as the paradigm for going on a journey is not what we should be doing. We should be setting new goals and sort of new behaviors and moving towards those. And yes, we're on a journey, so we got to take the baggage with us, but it's not what's driving us.
Right. If I'm headed to the beach, I'm taking the bathing suit, not the snow parka, right? So it's kind of like you want the destination to define what the baggage is.
Right. So, basically, I'm not that hopeful that this is going to happen. I will encourage it. I will nurture it. If somebody asks me actually to help do it, I'd be happy to put some thought and effort into it, because I spent 25 years consulting around cultural change. So I sort of know what's required. I'm waiting for someone to stand up in authority and actually sponsor that journey. And, because for these big kind of cultural changes, if there isn't a really strong sponsor with a bit of clout, then it's just not going to get done, because you spend too much time fighting your legacy battles.
And there's a lot of sacred cows that you have to kill first in the process.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
I have one more question, and then this could be the last question. What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby then?
I think really finding people with shared interests, regardless of age or location. If they're down the street, fine. If they're in Israel, fine. If they're old or young, it doesn't really matter. Just find and communicate and enjoy sort of sharing common interests. So I think that's what you need to do, but it's also being open to new ideas. If my local guy hadn't sort of turned me onto WordPress, I would never have started my blog, right? If Ulrich Road hadn't gotten me excited about receiver design back in 1980, I mean, he stimulated what's been more than a 40-year passion. So it's not just finding people that share your current interests. It's sort of, exploring and testing out new ideas that you might find interesting. I mean, a hobby is something where you learn for fun. That's basically what a hobby is, right? You learn and you do stuff for fun. It's very personal. It's very informal. And so you always want to be open to new ideas and find people that you can sort of experiment and try things with. And even if it's just operating, I mean, you could apply the same advice to somebody who wants to do contests. Find someone who knows how to do it, talk to them about it, maybe go and experience their contest station, read articles about it, try it yourself, and away you go. The trouble with our hobby is it's almost like there's too many things to do. And because of that, it's hard to find enough local people that maybe want to do the same things you do. But you can find them all around the world and talk to them on DMR just like they're in your living room. And let's maybe use our hobby more to actually do different things. DMR, for example, is wonderful. If you get a group together and assign yourself a talk group and stuff like that, you can get people focused on 3D printing and ham radio everywhere in the world, and it costs next to nothing.
And that's pretty amazing. John, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. You've really kind of blown my mind in terms of different ways to look at things, even at renaming amateur radio. I actually hadn't thought about it, but I've got a new fuse burning now.
Yeah, well, that's sort of the trouble with being retired is you think of all these things, but you don't have enough time. You don't have your 10,000 hours left to become expert in them. So you try to sort of stimulate younger people to sort of pick up the torch and run with it.
Well, it's not a bad idea. And it doesn't mean that you have to be the one to do it. All you have to do is be the guy to start the fire.
Well, one of the things I learned in consulting, maybe the most important thing, is I was often hired to come up with a plan to do something. Later in life, I realized there was really only one important criteria as to whether or not it was a good plan. And that criteria was your client's ability to implement it. It's great to talk about reinventing amateur radio and all that stuff, but you need to find a client that actually has the ability to do it. Otherwise, your plan is just not going to succeed. And there again, this is another rat hole we can go down for an hour, and I'll stop right there. But let me encourage, a lot of hams are in their retirement now. You're not too old to learn a whole bunch of new stuff. And I'm actually doing stuff now that I dreamt about doing when I was 30, but never had the time to do it, right? And I'm doing it in new ways and better ways and having a lot of fun. I don't know how long this will last, but, my retirement has been so enjoyable because of all these projects and learning and making new friends around the world. So I wish I'd retired 10 years earlier because I could have done so much more.
Well, you know what? Maybe you'll encourage those people that are younger to look at retiring earlier if they can, or pursue something that they love like this for a living, maybe.
Yep.
Why not? John, thank you so much. I want to wish you 73, and thank you for joining me on the QSO Today podcast.
Thank you, Eric, and keep up the great work. I really enjoy the stuff you're doing.
Thank you so much. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with John. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K0IZ in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to Icom America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of Icom America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.